From New York, this is Democracy Now!
Free speech is under assault like never before. The 25th Amendment is of zero risk to me, but will come back to haunt Joe Biden and the Biden administration. As the expression goes, be careful what you wish for.
In President Trump's first public appearance since his supporters stormed the Capitol, he denies any responsibility for the violent insurrection. The mob reportedly included police officers from Seattle to New York. Now, the FBI is warning Trump loyalists plan to hold armed protests nationwide ahead of Biden's inauguration next week. We'll speak with Yale University scholar Timothy Snyder about his new cover story in the New York Times Magazine, The American Abyss, a historian of fascism and political atrocity on Trump, the mob, and what comes next. Then 4,327. That's the record-shattering one-day coronavirus death toll in the United States. We'll go to Los Angeles, which is expected to hit 1 million COVID infections this week, to look at how the virus has hit the Latinx and indigenous communities hardest.
Many people were left without work in other industries such as hotels, restaurants, or factories. So many people in our community, because they have the necessity, and others because they do not have documents and do not receive aid from the local or state or federal government, they have no other option but to go to work in the fields, and many of them do not know the risks.
We'll speak with Odelia Romero, a Zapotec interpreter who founded Indigenous Communities in Leadership, which helps raise more than $1 million in COVID relief to help Los Angeles indigenous communities, and recently published a book documenting their stories of life during the pandemic. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The House is voting today to impeach President Trump for the second time in his single term. Lawmakers will vote on one article of impeachment against Trump for inciting the deadly riot at the U.S. Capitol last week, which left 5 people dead. On Tuesday, House lawmakers approved a resolution calling for Trump to be removed by invoking the 25th Amendment. But Vice President Mike Pence rejected that effort. Pence spoke with Trump Monday evening in the Oval Office in their first meeting since last week's mob violence. Among the chants of the mob, "Hang Mike Pence." 4 House Republicans said Tuesday they would vote to impeach President Trump, including Wyoming Congressmember and Republican House Leader Liz Cheney, the third-ranking Republican in the House. The White House says they expect at least 20 Republicans will support impeachment, though other estimates are lower. The New York Times reports Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell believes Trump committed impeachable offenses and privately supports Democrats' efforts to remove him, which he hopes will help purge Trump from the Republican Party. Meanwhile, House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy, a close Trump ally, has reportedly asked other Republicans if he should call on Trump to resign. Trump continues to deny any involvement or responsibility for the violent insurrection last Wednesday, calling his pre-riot speech totally appropriate and casting himself again as the victim of a witch hunt. He instead blamed Democrats for fomenting anger and creating a dangerous situation.
This impeachment is causing tremendous anger, and you're doing it, and it's really a terrible thing that they're doing. For Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer to continue on this path, I think it's causing tremendous danger to our country, and it's causing tremendous anger. I want no violence.
President-elect Joe Biden has reportedly spoken to Mitch McConnell this week about using the process of bifurcation once he's sworn in, which would allow impeachment proceedings to go ahead while at the same time allowing for the confirmation of his cabinet picks and taking up a sweeping pandemic relief package. The Washington Post is reporting the FBI explicitly warned of violence and war at the U.S. Capitol in an internal report issued one day before last Wednesday's deadly invasion. The report cited online posts, including one which said, quote, Congress needs to hear glass breaking, doors being kicked in, and blood from their BLM and Pantifa slave soldiers being spilled. Get violent. Stop calling this a march or rally or a protest. Go there ready for war. We get our president or we die, the statement said. Pantifa is a derogatory reference to Antifa or anti-fascist protesters. The military's Joint Chiefs of Staff have issued a rare joint message condemning the riot at the U.S. Capitol. The chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, signed on to the letter, which reads in part, the rights of freedom of speech and assembly do not give anyone the right to resort to violence, sedition, and insurrection, unquote. Illinois Congressmember Brad Schneider is at least the third lawmaker to test positive for COVID-19 following the Capitol Hill lockdown, during which multiple Republican lawmakers refused to wear face masks in cramped isolation spaces with their Democratic colleagues. The House adopted a new rule Tuesday which would fine lawmakers if they refuse to wear a face mask on the floor. They will face a $500 fine for the first offense, and a second strike incurs a $2,500 fine, which would be deducted from their pay. New Jersey Democrat Congressmember Mikey Sherrill said Tuesday she witnessed unnamed Republican colleagues giving reconnaissance tours one day before the riot, and that she would make sure those lawmakers are held accountable. Meanwhile, New York Congressmember Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez says she had a, quote, very close encounter during the Capitol siege, during which she feared for her life. She refrained from providing further details, but said in an Instagram live post Tuesday her fellow right-wing Congress members contributed to her fears that day.
I myself did not even feel safe going to that extraction point because there were QAnon and white supremacist sympathizers and, frankly, white supremacist members of Congress in that extraction point who I know and who I had felt would disclose my location.
Ali Alexander, a leader of last week's so-called Stop the Steal riot, has said 3 Republican House members helped organize last week's violent attack on the Capitol. House Freedom Caucus head, Congressmember Andy Biggs, Paul Gosar of Arizona, and Mo Brooks of Alabama. Meanwhile, around the country, law enforcement and the military are looking into whether their members took part in last week's violent Capitol attack. Philadelphia Transit Police are investigating 7 officers who took part in the siege. The FBI has opened some 170 cases on individuals involved in the assault and says hundreds more will be opened in the coming weeks. Over 70 people have been charged so far. This comes as the FBI is warning Trump loyalists plan to hold armed protests nationwide ahead of Biden's inauguration next week. Screenshots of archived content appear to show plans for mass armed actions in Washington, D.C. this weekend. The plans posted by the Patriot Action for America involve sending 15,000 armed extremists to surround government buildings and lock down central D.C. In Indiana, officials at the federal prison in Terre Haute executed Lisa Montgomery today in the early hours of the morning, despite a series of last-minute court orders that temporarily halted her death. The Supreme Court ultimately sided with Trump and ruled to proceed with her execution. Montgomery was the only woman on federal death row and the first woman to be executed by the U.S. government in nearly 70 years. Her lawyers repeatedly argued that a lifetime of sexual abuse and trauma led to severe mental illness. The federal government has also appealed stays on the executions of Corey Johnson and Dustin Higgs, who are scheduled to die later this week. The U.S. reported a new world record for COVID-19 deaths Tuesday, with 4,327 people dying around the country. Over 215,000 new cases were reported. In an effort to speed up the rollout of vaccines, the Centers for Disease Control has expanded its guidelines to include eligibility to anyone 65 years old and older, as well as those with some underlying health conditions. This is Health and Human Services Secretary Alex Azar.
Every vaccine dose that is sitting in a warehouse rather than going into an arm could mean one more life lost or one more hospital bed occupied.
The CDC also announced Tuesday it will start requiring all international travelers to the U.S. to show proof of a negative COVID-19 test before boarding their flights. In California, the superintendent of the Los Angeles School District said students must get vaccinated when it becomes possible before they're allowed to return to campus. In international news, Indian authorities have started distributing COVID-19 vaccine doses in its effort to administer shots to 1.3 billion people in what officials are calling the world's biggest vaccination drive. Malaysia suspended its parliament and state legislatures, declaring a state of emergency amidst a new lockdown. Rights groups say the extraordinary measure is an attempt by the Prime Minister to hold on to power by blocking elections and removing parliamentary oversight. In the Middle East, Israel's refused a request from the World Health Organization to make coronavirus vaccines available to Palestinian medical workers. Israel rolled out its vaccine at record speed, but has come under fire for neglecting to vaccinate Palestinians in the occupied territories. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo Tuesday claimed al-Qaeda's new home base is Iran and that the group has centralized its leadership in Tehran. Pompeo did not provide any substantial evidence. Iranian officials immediately refuted the allegations. This comes as Iranian leaders have warned the Trump administration may be planning an attack before President-elect Joe Biden is sworn in next week. India's Supreme Court has stayed the implementation of highly contested farm laws that seek to deregulate agricultural markets. The laws triggered historic ongoing protests outside New Delhi and around the country since late November. The court is appointing a committee to hear farmers' grievances. The Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, has said he would not repeal the laws, while farmers have vowed to keep protesting as long as needed. In Ireland, a devastating new report details the neglect and other abuse faced by tens of thousands of babies, children and women at so-called mother and baby homes, which were run by the Catholic Church from the 20s to the 1990s. An estimated 9,000 children and babies died in the homes, which were created to hide away unmarried pregnant people in the strict Catholic country. The government will issue a formal state apology to the survivors. This is Peter Mulryan, who survived one such home, describing the abuse he and others faced.
We're neglected, no love showing whatsoever. It wouldn't have been done to animals what we had to suffer. And babies crying through the night. Why? Because they were uncomfortable, they were neglected, starved and cold.
In Nigeria, prominent journalist and activist Omoyele Sowore has been released by authorities following his arrest at a peaceful New Year's Eve anti-government protest. Sowore ran for president of Nigeria in 2019 as the founder of the New York-based news outlet Sahara Reporters. He's previously been targeted and arrested for organizing protests against President Muhammadu Buhari and called for a popular revolution. To see our interview with Omoyele Sowore, you can go to democracynow.org. A warning to our viewers: this headline contains disturbing images. In China, images of a delivery driver who set himself on fire to protest unpaid wages has gone viral. The driver previously worked for the e-commerce giant Alibaba. He can be heard in social media videos telling witnesses who rushed to his aid, "I want my blood and sweat money back." His daughter has set up a crowdfunding page to help cover the cost of medical treatments for his severe burns. In U.S. labor news, the Service Employees International Union and drivers for ride-hailing companies are asking the California Supreme Court to invalidate Proposition 22, arguing it's unconstitutional. Prop 22, which passed in November, exempts companies like Uber and Lyft from having to classify their workers as employees rather than as independent contractors, depriving gig workers of basic wage and labor protections. The Associated Press reports former Michigan Governor Rick Snyder and other former officials are being charged in the wake of a new investigation of the Flint water crisis. In 2014, Flint's unelected emergency manager, appointed by then-Governor Snyder, switched Flint's water supply to the Flint River as a cost-saving measure. The move has been linked to at least 12 deaths from an outbreak of Legionnaire's disease and widespread lead poisoning in residents, including children, in the majority black city. To see our documentary on the poisoning of an American city, go to democracynow.org. And billionaire casino owner and Republican mega-donor Sheldon Adelson has died at the age of 87. Adelson was Donald Trump's largest single donor during the 2016 race. Since 2015, Adelson donated more than $250 million to Trump, other Republicans, and right-wing super PACs. He was also an influential political force in Israel, where he used his news outlets to back Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and the expansion of illegal Israeli settlements in the occupied Palestinian territories. He will be buried in Israel. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. When we come back, we turn to Yale scholar Timothy Snyder, talking about the American abyss. Yes, a historian of fascism and political atrocity on Trump, the mob, and what comes next. Stay with us. Too much pressure, the selector. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman in New York, joined by my co-host Juan Gonzalez in New Brunswick, New Jersey. Hi, Juan.
Hi, Amy, and welcome to all of our listeners and viewers across the country and around the world.
Well, history is being made today in Washington, D.C., as the House is voting to impeach President Trump for a second time. That's 1 week after he encouraged a violent mob to fight like hell and attack the Capitol as members of Congress voted to ratify Joe Biden's Electoral College victory in the 2020 election. The deadly siege so enraged Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell that he's now reportedly privately backing impeachment, along with a growing number of Republicans, including Congressmember Liz Cheney of Wyoming, the third-ranking Republican in the House. On Tuesday, Vice President Pence rejected a call from the House to invoke the 25th Amendment to the Constitution to remove Trump from office. Meanwhile, several Republican lawmakers bypassed metal detectors to enter the House floor that were installed after last week's deadly attack, including the newly elected Colorado Republican QAnon supporter, Congressmember Lauren Boebert, who vowed in a viral video to carry a gun in the Capitol. Far from the commotion, President Trump surrounded himself with supporters during a visit to the border wall in Alamo, Texas. In his first public appearance since the violence at the Capitol, he continued to deny any involvement with or responsibility for the violent insurrection. This comes as the Washington Post reports the FBI explicitly warned of violence and war at the U.S. Capitol in an internal report issued one day before last Wednesday's deadly Capitol invasion. And police officers from Seattle to New York are under investigation for participating in storming the Capitol, along with members of the New York Fire Department and apparently 7 Philadelphia Transit police officers. 2 black officers who defended the Capitol during the attack confirmed to BuzzFeed News that some of the insurgents they came face-to-face with were off-duty cops. Others were reportedly former military service members. On Tuesday, the Joint Chiefs of Staff sent a reminder to members of the armed forces that, quote, the rights of freedom of speech and assembly do not give anyone the right to resort to violence, sedition, and insurrection, unquote. The FBI has opened some 170 cases on individuals involved in the assault and says hundreds more will be opened in the coming weeks. Over 70 people have been charged so far. Now the FBI is warning Trump loyalists plan to hold armed protests nationwide ahead of Biden's inauguration next week. Screenshots of archived content appear to show plans for mass armed actions in Washington, D.C. this weekend. For more, we're joined by Timothy Snyder, professor of history at Yale University, fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna, where he now joins us from. He is the author of several books, including On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century. His new essay in the New York Times Magazine is headlined, The American Abyss, a historian of fascism and political atrocity on Trump, the mob, and what comes next. Professor Snyder, welcome back to Democracy Now! We're glad that you are physically doing well. We'll talk about that later. But let's talk about what happened. From your vantage point in Vienna, Austria, if you can talk about what you watched last week and why you see race at the core of this Trump-inspired insurrection.
Right. I mean, number one, it's kind of you, Amy, to mention the article. The reason why I could publish a big article about this part of the coup attempt right after it happened was that this was completely and utterly predictable. I already had the article drafted before the 6th of January because it was obvious to me what was going to happen. And so I just want to underline the points you were suggesting earlier about just how strange it was that this kind of thing could happen so easily. As to race, I mean, this is a classic historian's point. The point I make in the article is about the big lie. You know, I say that these are the kinds of things that happen if a charismatic leader with a big megaphone with a lot of reach is able to consistently tell one thing which is simply not true, but which deeply matters. Like, for example, I won an election that I lost. That has to lead to violence. But as you rightly suggest, the big lie has to be rooted in a particular society. And in the United States, the big lie is going to be rooted in race. Let's count the ways. Number one, what Mr. Trump is saying when he won the election is that there was fraud. And by fraud, he means the reality that African Americans are allowed to vote. When he speaks of Milwaukee or Atlanta or Detroit, what he's saying is black voters, right? When he's saying I won, he's saying I won if you only count the votes of the real Americans. Number two, think of Senator Cruz and his invocation of 1877. As every historian of the U.S. knows, and as lots of African American knows, but maybe not everybody knows, the Compromise of 1877 is the very moment when the American South was allowed to build up a basically American apartheid. The Compromise of 1877 is what allowed American states to push African Americans away from the voting booths and into a Jim Crow condition, which was going to last for nearly a century and which we're still dealing with today. Number three, look at the people who actually invade the Capitol. These are, and this has not been covered enough, this has not been hit hard enough, these people are basically white supremacists. The white supremacists are leading the way, right? They're leading the way, and they're making the argument that this is our house. In other words, what we think is that American government should be in the hands of white people who are willing to be violent about black people.
But Professor Snyder, I wanted to ask you, in terms of, you characterize it more as an attempted coup than perhaps maybe insurrection, because a coup assumes that there was an actual, it seems to me, an actual plot afoot by the coup makers. And in this situation, it appears to be that that Trump egged on the mob clearly, and that it seems to me there's always been a right-wing fascist movement in the United States in search of a leader. I mean, if you go back to Father Coughlin in the 30s, Huey Long, George Wallace, there's always been a significant portion of the American population that has lent itself or seen itself in right-wing and anti-democratic terms, and now they actually have a leader in the White House. So to what degree was this really an opportunism that Trump took advantage of to unleash the mob as opposed to a coup where military leaders or key officials got together to plan an overthrow?
Yeah, I take that point. I mean, I would emphasize, Juan, that it's important that we not get too lost in definitional disagreements about whether we're going to say coup or putsch or insurrection. The American Republic is hanging by a thread because the President of the United States has sought to use violence to stay in power and essentially to overthrow our constitutional system. There's broad agreement about that. I've been calling it a coup for a long time, actually. I mean, for months, for the following reasons. Or a coup attempt, to be precise, because it's been clear for a long time, because Mr. Trump has said so himself, that he intends to stay in power after losing the election. That's been his language for more than 6 months. He's been trying to bring the military into it. That was clear on June the 1st. At Lafayette Square. And it's also clear from these repeated statements from today, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, a few days ago, the 10 former Secretaries of Defense. The reason why these people have to make these statements is that they're aware that Mr. Trump is trying to get or has a certain amount of support in the military, right? So it's a coup attempt, in my view, because Mr. Trump has said he's going to try to change the nature of the American regime, and he's been trying to use instruments inside American institutions. Now, beyond that, I would point out that this wasn't just a mob. I mean, as you know very well, and as you just said, these aren't just people who happen to be there. These are several different kinds of white supremacist and extreme right-wing paramilitaries who are appearing at the Capitol. They are getting mixed in now with members of the police. And this is extremely dangerous because it's that mixture of outside the state, outside the law paramilitaries and police forces or policemen who start to go over on the other side, which is very characteristic of the way fascist regimes come to power.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up specifically on that issue of the military, because obviously those who know the history of the rise of Hitler know that a lot of his base was embittered and disillusioned veterans of World War I who felt that they had been unjustly treated or had no economic opportunities under the Weimar Republic. The United States military today is 40% people of color. To what degree are the progressives of this country not paying enough attention to actually organizing and reaching out to the enlisted troops of our country in terms of what's going on? Because clearly back in the days of the Vietnam War, it was organizing among the military that really finally convinced this government that they could no longer continue to move forward with the war.
That's a really interesting question. I mean, I think looking back at the last half century, 60 years of U.S. history, the integration of the military is one of the most significant things that happened, not just in terms of obvious justice. You know, as everyone knows, we fought the Second World War against racism with an army which was organized by race. but not just ethically, but also politically. I mean, before even getting to the point that you're making, I think it's very much the case that the commanders of our armed services are perfectly aware what it means to have integrated services. It means that any kind of attempt to get involved in politics in a Trumpian way would be extremely divisive. But it also means that people in the military, perhaps more in other walks of life, or to be specific, white people in the military, perhaps more in other walks of life, are actually in contact with and sometimes hear points of view of folks who have different backgrounds and different experiences than themselves. I would agree completely with your point. I mean, it's not always easy to be in contact with people who are in the military. They could be overseas. They could be on a base. But I certainly take your point that folks on the left sometimes have a certain tendency to pigeonhole all institutions and miss some openings.
I wanted to ask you, Professor Snyder, about who was involved in this attack. Some have called it the Ku Klux Klan. That's C-O-U-P, Ku Klux Klan. And you make no apologies about referring to white supremacists leading this. Let's talk about the military and police involvement. It's just coming to light right now. It looked like this sort of disorderly array of people who took an opportunity last week. But now, as more and more video is coming out, it may well be that the front lines were quite well ordered. And now this latest news that the Seattle police were involved, that New York police officers were involved, that Philadelphia transit officers came down en masse, that PSYOPs person, at least one, was involved, psychological operations. Talk about this.
Okay, well, I mean, number one, when we talk about the coup plotters, just to make the obvious point, the most important is Donald Trump himself, who has been creating the psychological and the moral environment that makes this possible by telling a big lie in which he is a victim and people who voted for him are victims. I think in the second rank, we have to put Senators Cruz and Hawley. It's extremely important that these senators decided to make of January 6th a kind of carnival of mendacity in which they were going to exploit their official position in order to tell the big lie, and an occasion which should be formal and solemn. I think that makes them the second ranks of the plotters. Number three, as you say, there was a good deal of organization taking place, and the Anti-Defamation League and other non-governmental organizations were tracking this. But not able to get very much of a hearing, it seems to me, from government institutions. I mean, as a spectator from a long way away, it was obvious to me, as I say, that something like this was going to happen. I think, Amy, what follows from this is that in this interval between impeachment, which is going to now happen, and a trial, which I'm going to bet is going to happen after Biden's 100 days, there should be something like an independent blue ribbon commission of forensics experts, digital forensics experts, historians, national security people, lawyers, and activists who put together a beautiful and organized and fact-based report about what happened, so that 3 months from now, when there's a Senate vote, which I believe there will also be this document that makes it clear how people should vote, but also a document which can go down in history. Because, I mean, other days in infamy compared to this one don't compare. I mean, the January putsch is the day in infamy which we have to get right for historical purposes. If this becomes a myth of victimhood, if this becomes, as Mr. Trump says, something we should treasure, then the country is in trouble. We need to get the facts right and the history right and the story right on this one.
And Professor Snyder, where do you see the Republican Party and Donald Trump going after Biden is inaugurated? Clearly, the party had hitched its star to Trump, and now there is enormous upheaval within it in terms of the road ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not many people think this, but I'll go out on a limb and say it. I think it's going to be hard for Mr. Trump to continue to reside in the United States of America. He has a lot of debt, and he's facing, even before the 6th of January, he was facing a number of criminal charges, or not facing directly, but being investigated for a number of criminal charges in New York. I think it's going to be hard for him to keep his feet in the United States of America. Perhaps I'm wrong. As for the Republican Party, I mean, my way of seeing it, as I lay out in that article, American Abyss, is that the largest group of Republicans are people that you could call the gamers, the ones who work the system with the gerrymandering, with the dark money, with the voter suppression, who are in favor of, the quote unquote democracy that we have in America now, the unfortunately very limited democracy we have, because they know how to work it. Then there's a smaller faction, which in the article I call the breakers. Those are people like Trump or Cruz or Hawley, who've understood that one could actually come to power in the United States by entirely non-democratic means, by way of the mob, by way of throwing an election and lying about it. And I think that fraction is going to be there. Then there's a third, still smaller group, which you could call the honorable few, the people who have positions that I might disagree with, but who believe in the rule of law and who believe in telling the truth, right? Like Kinzinger or like Cheney or like Mitt Romney. I think the interesting thing to watch for is whether the center of power in the Republican Party now shifts from, being the breakers and the gamers together to being the gamers and the honorable few together. I think that's now likely to happen. And it would be, frankly, a very good thing for the Republican Party, because the Republican Party, by way of generations of voter suppression, has now got itself into a cul-de-sac. It's got itself into a dead end, where what's happening now is honestly the only thing which can happen. If you don't try to win campaigns with policy, but you try to win them by gaming the system, eventually there are going to be people who say, hey, let's not game the system anymore. Let's just break the system. And that happened in January 2021. And there's nowhere to go from there except further down into chaos and blood. So the Republican Party is not my party, but I think this is an opportunity for them to regroup. And I hope a number of them will see it that way.
So let's talk about what's going to happen in the coming days, what you expect. The word of all 50 capitals, state capitals, deeply concerned about attacks, the FBI warning about those attacks right through Inauguration Day. Then you have Congress member, as you mentioned, third in line in the House, Republican leadership, Congressmember Cheney, who said there's never been a greater betrayal by a president of the United States of his office and oath to the Constitution. I will vote to impeach the president. Many are asking why it took her so long. But then privately, McConnell speaking with Biden and working out what would happen. Like today, he will be impeached by the House. But then a trial could determine if they convict President Trump. They could decide the sanctions, like he can never run again for public office or for president, could end the pensions and the millions of dollars people don't realize former presidents get, that kind of thing. But working out this bifurcation deal where Senate will work both on approving cabinet members, but then also holding a trial, whether it goes from the leadership of McConnell to the leadership of Schumer. Can you explain what will be taking place, and if you expect this time, unlike last time when Trump was impeached, that he will be convicted in the Senate?
Well, you're asking a historian. I'm just going to answer as an American who doesn't know any more than you do, probably a lot less. I mean, my gut feeling about this is that it works very well for both Joe Biden and Mitch McConnell to have impeachment now and trial after 100 days of Biden. It works very well for Biden because he's got 100 days of stuff that he really needs to pass, and he needs to get his appointments made as quickly as possible, especially after this terribly chaotic transition. It works well for McConnell because it gets Republicans out of the heat of the moment, gives them some time to think about what happened. Right now, of course, Mr. Trump is very popular. Three months of Twitter silence, he probably will be less so. Probably some other things will happen in the meantime to make him less popular. I mean, for me as a historian, for someone who's concerned about facts, a very important element of this is in 3 months, we could have a really good, nonpartisan, expert-based investigation of what happened in the Department of Defense, in Homeland Security, in the FBI, in police departments, and on Capitol Hill that day, a report which could then be used in April or whenever, when the trial happens, to make sure that people see, at least people of any amount of reasonability see, that what's happening is a trial based upon the finding of fact and not some kind of emotional partisan exercise. So I can see how both sides have an interest in working it that way. Impeachment now and a trial later. And yes, I think the Republicans, what I feel is that the Republican gamers, as I think of them, I think they're shifting towards conviction. I think conviction is now a reality.
And finally, I wanted to ask about your new book, Our Malady, Lessons in Liberty from a Hospital Diary. In it, you write, the word freedom is hypocritical when spoken by the people who create the conditions that leave us sick and powerless. If our federal government and our commercial medicine makes us unhealthy, they are making us unfree. Since we last spoke, Professor Snyder, you almost died on New Year, Christmas Eve in 2019. If you can link what happened to you then and describe what happened to what we're seeing, this was pre-pandemic today.
Well, I think there's a big misunderstanding in America about what freedom is, and you can see that in the behavior and comportment of a lot of the people who stormed the Capitol. A lot of us seem to think that freedom is just about believing whatever we want to believe, even if it's not true, and freedom is just about acting on our impulses. We don't seem to understand that you can't really be a free person unless there's some factual world that you share with other people. We don't seem to understand that you can't really be a free person unless there are values that you can talk about out in the world. One of the things which has been clear for a long time in the U.S. and has only been clear, and has even been clear in the last year, is that if you deny people health care, you're making them less free. If you put people at unnecessary risk and make them more subject to disease or the fear of disease, you're making them less free. You're also making them more vulnerable physically and mentally to various kinds of demagoguery. So what happened on January 6th is partly the result, I would say, of a sick country. When you look at the people who carried this out, I mean, when you have a hard look at their comportment, at their faces, at the way they carried themselves, I mean, apart from all moral judgments, you're not looking at a healthy society there. So I think part of the renewal of American freedom in 2021 has to be the concept that we all have health as a human right, that Americans, people living on this territory of the United States of America, should have access to health as a human right, that health is one of the things that should come before profit. If we do that, we'll not only feel better and be freer, we'll recognize each other better as Americans because we'll be sharing in this together. So that's the way to bring it together. Thanks for the question.
Well, thanks so much, Timothy Snyder, and thank God you recovered from your appendicitis, misdiagnosed from where you were to right here in the United States. Timothy Snyder, Yale University professor, fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna, Austria, where he's speaking to us from. He's got the cover story of New York Times Magazine, The American Abyss, a historian of fascism and political atrocity on Trump, the mob, and what comes next. We will link to it at democracynow.org. And when we come back, another record-smashing day of coronavirus in the United States. We go to Los Angeles. Stay with us.
Tú eres la tristeza de mis ojos, que lloran en silencio por tu adiós. Me veo en el espejo y veo mi rostro, el tiempo que he sufrido por tu adiós. Obligo a que te olvide el pensamiento, pues siempre estoy pensando en el ayer. Prefiero estar dormida que despierta.
Lola Beltran singing Amor Eterno. That's eternal love. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. 4,327. That's the world record-shattering one-day coronavirus death toll in the United States. That's more than the total number of people who've died of COVID in South Korea. It's more than the total number of people who've died of COVID in Japan, again, through the entire pandemic. As the U.S. hits yet another COVID-19 world record, we go to California, where the epicenter, Los Angeles County, is expected to hit 1 million COVID-19 infections by the end of the week amidst reports of overflowing hospitals, record death tolls. With 1,600 deaths in the past week, L.A. is averaging a death every 6 minutes. The crisis point for Los Angeles comes as numbers soar across the state. On Monday, Governor Gavin Newsom said the state would open mass vaccination sites.
Recognize that the current strategy is not going to get us to where we need to go as quickly as we all need to go. And so that's why we're speeding up the administration, not just for priority groups, but also now opening up large sites to do so, meaning Dodger Stadium, Padres Stadium, Cal Expo, these large mass vaccination sites. You start to see those coming up as early as this week.
The virus has hit Latinx and indigenous communities in Los Angeles the hardest as COVID-19 ravages working-class neighborhoods where many are essential workers. This is Dr. Edgar Chavez, who works in a community clinic in Los Angeles, speaking to NBC.
It's really hard for us to see our population doing the work that nobody else wants to do, front-facing, exposing themselves to COVID, and then dying from COVID, and then not getting the health care that they need, not getting the vaccine fast enough.
Los Angeles' indigenous communities from Mexico and Central America have been particularly impacted as they face both the crisis of COVID-19 and additional language barriers and lack of access to information and care. For more, we go to Los Angeles, where we're joined by Odilia Romero, co-founder and executive director of Indigenous Communities and Leadership, or Cielo, an indigenous women-led nonprofit that has raised over $1 million for coronavirus relief for LA's indigenous communities. It also recently published a book called a book, which I'm going to ask her to pronounce, documenting the stories of undocumented indigenous women from Mexico and Guatemala living in the midst of the pandemic. Odilia Romero is a Zapotec interpreter, has been an indigenous leader with the Binational Front of Indigenous Organizations for a quarter of a century. Odilia, welcome back to Democracy Now! Please, so I don't mispronounce it, tell us the name of your book, and then talk about the indigenous immigrant communities and what's happening now in the midst of this record-shattering pandemic.
Good morning, Amy. Thank you for having me again. Padios. The name of the book is Dijanore, Palabra Mujer, or Women's Word. And what COVID and indigenous communities in LA County has been devastating. You know, every time I talk to someone in the community, the mechanic died, the healer died, the dancer died. And that is like every day we get to talk to people, and it's a tragedy. I spoke to someone yesterday, and they're like, already 8 people this week die in my community. Another woman told me 4 people die in my community. So every day that I talk to someone in that community, there's more and more dead. And this happens because indigenous people, we don't have the privilege to stay home and not go to work, right? We have to go to work as we, through our Undocumented Indigenous Fund, we've heard a lot of story. I don't have money to pay for my rent. The funds that I'm getting through Cielo, it goes directly to my rent. I don't have food. I have to work. I'm selling food on the street. So this puts you in a condition that you put yourself at risk to get COVID. And once you have it, you live in a apartment. Some people now have lost their apartments, and now they're living with other families. So one gets infected, the rest will get infected. So it's been really painful to see the impacts of COVID in indigenous communities. The infection rate is very high. And when they go to the hospital, well, you are there, even if you spoke Spanish or English, you're alone. But as you get there, there's no one that interprets in your language. And when this pandemic started, when we started the funds, it was a person I know knows a person that had COVID during the summer. Oh, a person in my family had COVID. Now it's like when you talk to people, I have COVID. My family has a family member has died of COVID. My mother has died of COVID. My mother has been in the hospital personally. My mom was in the hospital for 10 days. And her being there, not being able to see her, not talk to her, her not being able to communicate in her indigenous language was devastating, that she fell into a deep depression that for a moment, we thought we were going to lose her. So all this is happening with indigenous communities, the lack of funds, the lack of, there's a lot of food insecurity. So we're going through a lot currently, Amy.
And Odelia, I'm wondering when we hear the stories, and it's one outrageous story after another in recent days of the inequality and how this pandemic is being dealt with. I think specifically, for instance, National Football League athletes. Of football players getting tested for COVID every single day just to assure that the football games can go on. Or we're hearing of these elite medical institutions like Columbia Presbyterian and Brigham Hospital of vaccinating not only the workers, the emergency room workers who are actually dealing with COVID patients, but they're vaccinating their grad students, they're vaccinating their administrators, they're vaccinating all kinds of other people who really aren't at risk. And meanwhile, you're facing this crisis in Los Angeles. When you hear some of these stories, what's your reaction?
My personal reaction, our staff reaction, it's like these. When we hear the community stories, it's very heartbreaking. You know, there are days like when the team, we meet in the evening, we're all quarantined together, and we just like sit there and don't know what to do. Our hands are tied. We've only raised $3.4 million, and it sounds like a lot of money, but it only helps 5,000 people. You know, when people call, like, do you have any food for me? Do you have any money for the rent? Because, you know, I'm being threatened by the landlord. And then you hear these, you know, and I have to go to work. I'm infected. When we talk to people before coughing, you know, when you hear the privilege of others, when the essential workers are not getting vaccinated, it's very heartbreaking, and it's very personally very frustrating. Like, I wouldn't have the words to tell you like my feeling of anger at times, because I see indigenous communities at the forefront, from the farm, from the agricultural fields to the restaurant, to the hospitality industry, to the cleaners. We are there, and we don't have access to the vaccine. We don't have access to any more funds but what we have in Cielo. And what we have in Cielo, it's like, it sounds like a lot of money, but it's really nothing compared to the need that people have right now. And on top of, we have to talk about people not knowing how to, they can't work because they have children, they have to stay at home. One parent told me the other day, you know, there's 4 families living in our household, and the kids are asking for pizza. And we have to take turns. One family buys a pizza, and we prioritize the kids. You know, some families have shared that now they're reducing their intake of food, and they prioritize the kids. So it's very heartbreaking.
I'm wondering also, Odelia, I'm wondering also what's been the actions of Governor Newsom and the state at the state level to assist some of the most hard-hit communities, especially in places like Los Angeles, where a good percentage of the people are undocumented and are not cannot partake of any of the assistance handed down by the federal government.
Well, there has been a lot of support to undocumented communities. They had the California Relief Fund, but there has been an effort. But as far as for particularly indigenous people, there hasn't, because then you have to go, you are labeled as Latinx, so then the box is checked that you've been supporting undocumented Latinos, but we're not Latinos, right? So in order for indigenous people to access all these resources, one, you know, there's the language barrier. A lot of us did not go have college education, so we don't know how to read and write. So that does not allow us to access a lot of the funds. and we hear this from different community members. I have applied, and some of the beautiful things that come out of this is like we're able to speak the language. Our staff, there's Quiche, Zapotec, Mixtec, and we're able to communicate with the community. That makes a big difference for them to access the funds. There has been little effort for indigenous communities.
I wanted to continue on that point of who is dying, the lives lost, and the knowledge lost. As you were talking, I was thinking about a conversation I had with a member of the Standing Rock Sioux. And there they have prioritized speakers of the native languages for its COVID-19 vaccine distribution because cultures and languages are dying out with the death of these elders during COVID. And if you can talk about, Odilia, what's happening in Los Angeles, as you're a Zapotec interpreter talking about the Zapotec, the Quiche, and what data doesn't show? You've talked about it as erasing indigenous people.
Let's say for last night, the county health department put out death. So far, new death is 288. I know at least 15 people are indigenous people that died because I've talked to the family members, because our team has talked to them. The new cases, right? There has been 11,944. I know also that maybe 100 of them are indigenous communities. And you might say the numbers are small, but because we're a small population, this is it's the loss of lives, people being infected, and the loss of knowledge it's there, right? Some of the elders have passed away, and there goes a whole world view. Last week, someone in the community died that she knew the stories of migration. She was one of the first women that came to the U.S., and she brought a lot of other women. And all those stories are gone. And the language is dying with COVID more than ever, especially here in L.A. with the elders. I speak the language, but when my mom was in the hospital, that's one of the things I thought. We never documented her story, like what's going to happen with all the recipes of food that my mom has, like everything. So it's one of those things that for us, it's so important. It would be great if if indigenous community will have access to the vaccine, because there's so much knowledge that will be gone with COVID, and because we live in confined places here in LA, the risk of elders getting infected and dying is a lot higher than in any other places. And the language, the traditions, when one of the traditional healer was in the hospital, I called and tried to, he doesn't speak Spanish, he doesn't speak English. How do I communicate with him? That was impossible. Luckily, he's home and he's doing better, but it is these things that are heartbreaking for us here at Cielo.
We want to thank you so much, Odilia, for joining us. Odilia Romero, Zapotec interpreter with Indigenous Communities in Leadership, which helped raise more than $1 million in COVID-19 relief to help Los Angeles Indigenous immigrant communities, has published a book documenting their stories of living and dying during the pandemic. That does it for our broadcast. You can watch the House impeachment proceedings. The first time in history a president will be impeached twice. On our website, democracynow.org, we'll be streaming the full debate and vote starting at 9 a.m. Eastern Time. That does it for our show. Democracy Now! Is produced with Renee Feltz, Mike Burke, Dina Guzder, Libby Rainey, Nermeen Sheikh, Maria Terracena, Carla Wills, Tommy Waranoff, Tarina Nadura, Sam Alcoff, Taymari Astudio, John Hamilton, Robbie Karen, Hani Massoud, and Adriano Contreras. Our general manager, Julie Crosby. Special thanks to Becca Staley, Miriam Bernard, Paul Powell, Mike DeFilippo, Miguel Noguera, Hugh Grant, Dennis Moynihan, David Prude, and Dennis McCormick. Remember, wearing a mask is an act of love. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Thanks for joining us.